Okay, Boker Tov. I think it's 9:30. We can start. Hope everybody's doing well. Okay, today we will finish the first parak in Pirkei Avot, and I think start the second parak too. But we were talking last week. We left off how Shimon Beno, how Shimon, the son of Rabban Gamliel. That's there, as we mentioned, there were really 6 generations. I don't know how much I mentioned this. There were 6 generations of Tanaim, basically the rabbis of the Mishnah. We sort of date it to Hillel as the first of the Nasi, and then you have Rabban Gamliel, who's probably his son. Rabban Gamliel is maybe his grandson. Rabban Gamliel Hazaken, the elder Rabban Gamliel, we call him, and then his son. That's who we learned about last week. That to be quiet. The best thing is not to talk too much, and it's doing, not learning, that's important. That was what we spoke about. So his son called Shimon, because he wasn't the rabbi yet. He was young. So he actually died young. He was killed during the Roman destruction of Yerushalayim, the Beit HaMikdash. And then his son is Rabban Shimon's son, the first Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. His son is Rabban Gamliel of Yavneh, whose son is the second Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, who's up in Usha, up north. And then his son is Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, of course, who's the editor of the Mishnah. So you have in the Mishnah Rabban Gamliel, Shimon, and then the next Mishnah, I mentioned this in the first week, we would expect Rabban Gamliel of Yavneh, but that's not who we get. We get Rav Shimon ben Gamliel. In other words, it's very striking when you look at the whole chapter, how we go in exact chronological order from the 5 generations of Zugot, the 5 generations sort of predating the Tanaim, and then we have all the generations of the Tanaim, and the next Mishnah is going to pick up with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, even, which is very strange. We're going to pick up, and we skipped Rabban Gamliel of Yavneh. So I don't know exactly if that's a decision Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi made because Rabban Gamliel was impeached, and it's very interesting. I don't exactly know why, but I think it's striking that Rabban Gamliel is missing. Now, Rabban Gamliel is also missing, of course, from the Pesach Seder. I think I mentioned this the first week we had our Pirkei Avot class with the Seder in Bnei Brak, and that's probably very likely because he was impeached and that Seder took place in that time period. But what I find very interesting, if you look at the first Mishnah in entire Shas, the first parak of Brachot, so we start, when do we say the Shema at night? And then the first person quoted in the Mishnah is Rabbi Eliezer. That's Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol. Now, kind of, say it's meaningless, but I don't think it's so meaningless. Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol, of course, is the person who was put into Cherem, the person who was excommunicated on the famous story of Tanur Shalachnai. He refused to bow to the majority opinion, the story that teaches the importance or the primacy of the sage's interpretation of the Torah over God's interpretation of the Torah. It's a very tragic story. I've mentioned in other occasions that most people know the first half of the story. The second half of the story, Rabban Gamliel dies because of this story. Clearly, it's a very tragic story. It's told in the context of Ona'at Varim. The Gemara brings in that story in the context of verbal abuse. So it's clear the editors of the Gemara saw this story, the way they mistreated him. Anyway, so I find it very interesting that the first Tana, who Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi quotes in the Mishnah, is Rabbi Eliezer Hagadol. That's the first one, sort of to bring him back, so to speak, that, okay, that was an incident, but he's the first person quoted because he's arguing with the sages. Normally you would quote the sages first, and then the minority opinion. What's fascinating, I find, maybe it's a total coincidence, but I think it's fascinating, is the second person quoted is Rabban Gamliel, this Rabban Gamliel of Yavneh, and the third person quoted is Rabbi Yoshua. And of course, we know that Rabbi Yoshua and Rabban Gamliel had this big argument, and Rabban Gamliel was impeached and reinstated because over the calendar. So here you have, and it was Rabbi Yoshua who took on Rabbi Eliezer. When Rabbi Eliezer said, let the water flow backwards and the tree move, and all the proofs that he was right on the case of this oven, this irrelevant oven, because it was about laws of purity that had ceased to exist with the destruction of the temple, and they're living after the destruction of the temple. It was Rabbi Yoshua who argued with Rabbi Eliezer, who was the one who said Torah is not in heaven. So here you have this sort of recreation of Yavneh taking place in the opening chapter of shas of brachot, and I think that we want to bring them all together. And striking, of course, the Mishnah, that parak ends with Rav Elazar ben Azariah. That's the thing we quote at the Seder. That Rav Elazar ben Azariah said, I was almost like 7 years old, and I didn't know you say Kriyat Shema at night till Ben Zoma comes. So you got the whole Yavne recreated. Rav Elazar ben Azariah, of course, was the compromise candidate who was placed in after they impeached Raman Gamliel. Anyway, Raman Gamliel is missing. I find it striking. Okay, what does Rav Shimon ben Gamliel say? Last Mishnah, Perak Aleph, Mishnah Zayin in Pirkei Avot. Rav Shimon Gamliel Amir Ashlo Shadbrim Holam Omeid. On three things the world stands: Al Hadin, on justice, Emet, truth, and Shalom, on peace. So, of course, this reminds us right away of the Mishnah at the beginning of Pirkei Avot. Shimon Tzadik Hayomer Shloshad Vrim Holam Omeid. The world stands on three pillars, three things: Torah, Avodah, Ukmilut Chasadim. So, which is it? Is it Torah, Avodah, Ukmilut Chasadim? Torah, we assume worship of God, or on acts of kindness, or is it on justice, truth, and peace? So, of course, it's all of them. It's both. So, you can argue probably these two opinions are arguing. What are the three most important principles of the world? Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim, or Din, Emet, Shalom. Although that's not how most of the commentaries assume, I believe. They basically, the way the Bartanura, I believe, explains it is, Ashlo Shadrim Olam Omeid, the world was created for the purpose of three things. The world was created for Torah, Bereshit. God looked in the Torah and he created the world. The Torah is the blueprint of the world. In other words, we needed a world to have the Torah. It's like we always think in the reverse, but the way our sages understood it, Hishtaka ba'araita ubara alma. God created the world so the Torah could be fulfilled. So the Torah is the blueprint. So the purpose of the world is Torim Logriti. If God not for the covenant, the Torah, God would have not. That's a pasuk in Yirmiyahu. I would not have placed the heavens and the earth. That's avodah, worship of God. That's, of course, got us into trouble right at the beginning. Cain and Hevel, each worshiping God in their own way. But that's this sort of the next, the purpose of the world. And Gemilu Chasadim, Olam Chesed Yibaneh. The world was built on Chesed, created for Chesed. So I want to explain Torah, Avodah, Gemilu Chasadim is the purpose of the world. That's why the world was created. The way to get there, that's very nice. The world was created for that purpose. But if you want to live in this world, if you want people to get along and not to kill each other, you need justice, you need deen, you need truth. The signature of God is truth. And of course, you need peace. Peace is being the most important. So deen emet, one is why it was created, and the other is how do we keep the creation going. The Pirkei Israel says something kind of interesting. He said, sort of, this is second best. In other words, Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim, that's the ideal. And not everybody can live up to that. Torah, you have to put a lot of effort to keep the Torah, to study Torah. It's very hard to worship God. We all know davening, but I would say it's avodah, is service, the sacrifices. It's associated with prayer, avodah shabalev, right? The source of the Rambam, we alluded to this last night, came up, the obligation to pray. It's only the Rambam who says there's an obligation to pray biblically. It's a kind of a startling idea that most of the commentaries assume that prayer, the concept of prayer, is a rabbinic mitzvah. I mentioned last night, the Ramban beautifully says prayer is a gift that God allows us to pray, but it's not an obligation. What do you mean I'm obligated? I'm obligated to ask God to help me. What do you mean? If you don't want to help, don't ask. There's no obligation to pray. It's a great gift. The Rambam is the only one who says that there's a biblical obligation to pray once a day, and that's learned from Avodah. From it says you should worship the God with Avodah. You should service God with all your heart. It's very hard. We know how hard davening is. That's the way we service God through Avodah. It's very, very difficult. So Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim is also not always so easy. That's way. And secondly, of the Din Emet Shalom, to have a justice system, hopefully it's a little bit easier. No, that's if you can't live up to Torah, Avodah, Gemilut Chasadim. Okay, but what I want to spend a few minutes talking about is the relationship between Din Emet and Shalom. So when Din is emet. In other words, deen, strict justice, is truth. Now we know emet and rachamim, emet and, or why do we go to rachamim? Go to shalom. Emet and shalom cannot coexist. They can't. Sometimes they can, but as a general rule, if you want peace, you have to give up on truth a little bit. If everybody stands to their truth, it's very hard. The emet and shalom often don't exist, and we have a concept of hadan din emet la'amito. So let's talk about. So the Gemara says that a judge who's done din emet la'amito, somebody who judges truth to truth, din emet. That's the first two. Din emet la'amito, to its truth, brings the divine presence into the world. He becomes a partner with God in creation. So the question is, what does it mean? What does emet la'amito mean? What does truth to its truth mean? Either it's true or it's not true, right? What do you mean truth to its truth? So the Drisha, that's the Rav Yoshua Falk, that he wrote the commentary on Shulchan Aruch, the Smai. They wrote on the tour. Drisha lived in Poland born around the mid 1500s. Died, I believe, in the early 1600s. One of the great Polish rabbis. That's, the flourishing of Polish Jewry began a little before. He's the generation really after the Raman, Rav Shlomo Luria. This is the great flourishing of Torah in Poland in the 16th century. So he has a fascinating comment, and he says, "Din emet lamito." He says that something can be true, but it can be totally false. In other words, you can be true, but totally wrong. Din emet lamito means that the judgment of the judge not only has to be correct, but it has to be correct for its makom and zman, for its time and place. You have to know who you're dealing with, who we're talking to. You can have a din emet, you can say something is correct, but it's totally out of context. It doesn't work in that system. We discussed this before. Let's say, that's why it's very important you have a local rabbi, someone who knows the makom and zman. So you can have something that's true. It's, if you look in the source, if you look in the text, it's 100% true. But if you apply it in real life, it's really bad. It's really false. It's going to hurt. So you have to have a din emet, but that it works. I would say you have to have the theory and the practice. Now, and what is din emet lamito? So we explained din emet lamito is lifnim mishurat hadin. We all know the concept of lifnim mishurat hadin, to act beyond the call of duty. So I just want to spend a little bit focus on what this term means. What is the shurat hadin, and what does it mean to be lifnim? It's sort of a funny expression. Lifnim means before, literally lifnim, before the shurat hadin, before the straightness of the judgment. Shura is like a ruler. Straightness, before the straightness of the judgment, you have to be lifnim. You have to get out before it. So probably what it means, on a literal sense, is that din. The Gemara has a beautiful expression, Yikova din et har. The justice, din, pierces the mountain. In other words, when you go to court and you're going to judge, what are the legal responsibilities? The law couldn't care less about anything. They don't care if you grow up with, you didn't have parents, you grew up in a broken home, your community was discriminated against, you come from a racial minority. The law doesn't care about any of that stuff. You did something wrong, this is what the law pierces the mountain, doesn't care if you're a widow, if you're an orphan, if you're rich, if you're poor, doesn't care about anything. But we all know, so that's din. Yikova din et har. The law pierces the mountain, but we know that in the real world, we don't want to be that. That's din emet lo la'amito. We want to act lifnim mishurat hadin. We want to act before you get to the shurat hadin. In other words, we want to have what we call a pshara, a compromise, or people should basically settle their case before they get into court. And the Drisha says that sometimes a judge is not allowed to judge according to what it says in the Shulchan Aruch. He's not allowed to judge according to the law. He has to do a judgment of lifnim mishurat hadin. And that is the meaning of the verse, Lo tasur min hadavar, the rabbinic comment, Lo tasur min hadavar, shir yagidu lecha yamin usmol. The verse in Dvarim that tells us about talking about rabbinic authority. So it says if you have a problem, you go to the Beit Din, eventually you come up to Yerushalayim, nobody can solve the issue, you go to the Beit Din HaGadol in Yerushalayim, become Tavalita, you rise up, and then whatever they tell you, you got to do. Lo tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin u'shmol. You're not allowed to veer from the right or to the left. Rashi has a fascinating comment, which is actually a very controversial comment. Many actually don't really agree with Rashi. Rashi says that even if they tell you what's right is left and what's left is right, you have to listen. In other words, even if the rabbis are wrong, you have to listen. So that's debatable. But the way the Prisha understands that comment of Rashi is this exact point, that it's the obligation to act lifnim mishurat hadin. If they tell you your right is left, in other words, really the law is X, but because of many of the social factors, the personal factors, what's involved in the case, we're going to do lifnim. We're going to not act to pierce the mountain. We're going to act lifnim mishurat hadin, but that's telling you your right is left. Because really, according to the law, it's not like that. So that's what the Torah is telling us. Lo tasur min hadavar asher yagidu lecha yamin u'shmol. Do not veer to the right, nor to the left, even if they tell you the right is left. In other words, the obligation is to mix, to make sure in order to have shalom, you can't have din emet. You have to have din emet la'amito. You have to have so that's, of course, in a sense, it's obvious, but it's very important. Our justice system, our court system, Yikov Adin Tahar isn't enough. Lifnim Mishur Adin, before we get to the court. That's, or Rav Soloveitchik explained, Lifnim Mishur Adin is a judgment of Rachamim, and Din, Yikov Adin Tahar, is a judgment of Din. And we like Rachamim, we don't like Din so much. So that's Lifnim Mishur Adin. Now there is a famous, two famous Gemaras I want to quote briefly. One is that Jerusalem was destroyed because the Jewish people, it's the Gemara in Bava Metzia says, Jerusalem was destroyed because the Jewish people followed the Dinei Torah, followed the laws of the Torah. So the Gemara finds this statement rather perplexing, to put it mildly. He said, what are we, barbarians? What law should we follow? What do you mean Jerusalem was destroyed because we followed the law? So the Talmud says, no, they followed the law. They didn't do lifnim mishur hadin. Because the Jewish people weren't willing to act lifnim mishur hadin, Yerushalayim had to be destroyed. By the way, you'll ask me, what about sinat chinam? What about this? Yeah, this is a general side comment. The rabbis, of course, what do you mean? Yerushalayim was destroyed because the Romans had a stronger army. That's why Yerushalayim was destroyed. And we rebelled, and that probably wasn't so smart. And whatever. Yeah, that's why Yerushalayim was destroyed. The rabbis are looking for what message can we learn? What were we doing wrong? So yeah, we were fighting internal strife, sinat chinam, which is, of course, is connected. You can argue lifnim mishur hadin and not doing lifnim mishur hadin and sinat chinam. You can really argue are the same thing. The fact that you insist on strict justice and not acting beyond the letter of the law, that's an act of sinat chinam. But you have a Gemara in Shabbos that has like 7 different reasons why the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed. The most famous reason is sinat chinam, and most likely the rabbis were not always in Agadah. That's a very important methodological point. Always in Agadata, in the non-legal portion of the Gemara. They're not. They're often not meant literally, but the rabbis weren't concerned. The rabbis, you're living in the year 400. Like, who cares why the temple was destroyed in the year 70? You care what are the Jewish people doing wrong in the year 400 or the year 2020? What can we do to improve? So we take the Beit HaMikdash, we apply it to our life, and we say, that's Jonathan Sachs has a whole article about this in this Haggadah. The rabbis, of course, were talking to their generation, and to give it more oomph, they would relate what they're doing, to an earlier generation. So each one finds a different sin. This one did this wrong, this one did that wrong. The Jewish people did. So you have the most famous one is sinat chinam. So that's why we always go to. But that's not the only reason given for the Gemara. And again, the Gemara is not giving a historical reason. It's not giving it. It's not what you're not going to learn this in political science. It's the moral message. But anyway, so that's the Gemara says we lost Yerushalayim because of Sinat Chinuch. I think that Gemara is relatively well known. I don't know exactly. You can tell me yes or no. But then there's you can tell me privately. You don't have to tell me. Then there's a second Gemara which I think is not as well known. This is a Gemara in Brachot, and the Gemara in Brachot says, quoting Rabbi Yochanan, "Minayin she'Kadosh Baruch Hu mitpalel." How do we know that God davens? This is, of course, an amazing question. Anthropomorphism at its best. How do you know God prays? Now, not only is that question crazy, it's heretical, because the notion of prayer I just mentioned a few minutes ago, the reason the Ramban says there's no obligation to pray, because you pray if you need something. If you don't need something, you don't pray. God is very nice. He allows us to approach him in prayer. That's really, really kind. It's a great chesed of God. But you only pray because you need something. Rabbi Soloveitchik develops this at great length, the idea of prayer and things we need. So if we say God prays, that means God is needy. God needs things. The rabbis were not afraid to make comments like this, but that's you're just understand the heresy, so to speak. Of course, it's not really heresy, but within the question that God prays. But of course, the rabbis want to teach us. Whenever the rabbis say something about God, it's the same thing I just said about God. The rabbis aren't talking about God; they're talking about us. But they talk about us in terms of God. First of all, because we're many gods. We're created with Tselem Elohim. It's also a little heretical, but it says so in the Torah. We're created in the image of God. So, okay. Have to accept it. So we're like God a little bit, a lot not, a lot whatever. So when it says basically if God prays, what the Gemara is really telling us is we have to pray. They're not who know. We don't know what God does, but the Talmud, it's a way of very powerfully expressing the notion of the obligation of man to pray. Even God prays every day. Wow, that's unbelievable. So how do you know he prays? Does anybody know? I'll just throw it. I can put it in the chat. I think Mark, it's a pasuk. Pasuk in Yeshaya. You all know the pasuk. I think you all know the pasuk. V'haviotim el har kodeshi v'simachtim v'beit tefilati. Right? I'm going to bring you. We Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur time. V'haviotim el har kodeshi. I'll bring you to my holy mountain. V'simachtim v'beit tefilati, and you will rejoice. Right? You'll rejoice v'beit tefilati. You'll rejoice in my house of prayer. Tfilatam, it doesn't say in their house. God is talking, you'll come to my house of prayer. And what the pasuk really means, it's the place where man prays. But the Talmud interpreting in a very literal sense that tfilati is referring to God. So this teaches us that God prays. So the question is, that's very nice. It's cool. So the Gemara, I love these Gemaras. So the Gemara goes on next, my matzli. What does God daven? Okay, I want to know what we say Shmona Esrei every day. What does God daven when he davens? Right? He doesn't have to, but health. He doesn't need health. He has health. He's in eternal. So what's he davening for? Anybody want to know what he's davening for? Okay, so I'll tell you what he's davening for. God prays. You know, it's tough being in charge of these human beings. I want my attribute of mercy should conquer yichvosh yichvoshu rachamiyat kasi, should conquer my anger, my mercy. You know, these people, these human beings, they make me angry all the time. They sin, they do terrible things, but you know what? What do you want? They do so many wonderful things. They're humans. So I pray. God prays that he'll be able to control himself, and that his rachamim should be more than his deen. And v'yiglu rachamai midotai betnahegim b'midat rachamim. I'll act with my children with the attribute of mercy. V'chanes lehem lifnim mishur din. And I'll judge them lifnim mishur din. Of course, they're deserving to be punished, but I'm going to do lifnim mishur din. And obviously, if God prays every day that he should act lifnim mishur din, so it's not about God; it's about us. We have to pray every day. And what should we pray every day? We should pray that we should not get angry, and that our attribute of mercy should conquer our attribute of strict justice. And that's din emet la'amito. There's emet. Truth is, you know, at the same time, the Gemara in Shabbos says that, right, chotamo shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu emet. And we have to live with this sort of it's not exactly a contradiction, but I'd say a tension, that the attribute of God is truth. On the other hand, truth, you have to know when truth has to give way. We all know you're allowed to lie in certain areas. So that's the Gemara saying here on the importance of midat mitat harachamim, which is sort of shalom. So the Mishnah says you have din. Yes, you've got to start with justice. You got to know what's right. Then you move to emet, with truth, which is very related. But emet is not only pure truth. Emet is what's truth and that time and moment. And I know that's very funny because on the some hand, truth is the truth everywhere. But that's the idea of an overarching truth. We all know that. We know, I don't want to pick on politicians, but anybody, we all can say things that are technically true, but are big lies. We're very good at doing that. So there's din emet, but it all has to end in shalom. The purpose of this is to have peace, and beautiful how the first parak ends with peace. Everything we do in Judaism ends with peace. Our davening, that's how we end everything. So we end the first parak in Pirkei Avot, and the Mishnah quotes the pasuk emet mishpat shalom shivtu b'shoretechem. Okay, that's the end of the first parak. The second parak of Pirkei Avot, Rabbi Omer. Rabbi says. So Rabbi, of course, is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. This is very strange. And very strange. It's a little bit unusual because as the editor of the Mishnah, Rabbi, you don't have Rabbi quoting himself so much. He was he edited the Mishnah, sort of stays in the background. But and even more so, the next Mishnah, the famous Mishnah of Yafet Talmud Torah in Derech Eretz, the whole philosophy of Shimshon Frel that Torah is nice with Derech Eretz, that's said by Rabban Gamliel, but no Shor of Yehuda Nasi. Remember, as I've mentioned already a number of times, Pirkei Avot until Mishnah Dalid is a chronological recountment from the creation, from the giving of the Torah until the writing down of the Mishnah. In other words, Moshe Kibel Torah Sinai, through the Nevi'im, the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the five Zugot, and the Nisim, the Tanaim, skipping Rabban Gamliel for whatever reason, as we spoke about, coming to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, which is sort of the ending of the Mishnah. He writes it down, but it even goes one generation further. It even quotes Rabban Gamliel, which means either this was added later, or Rabbi can quote his own son. He's writing the Mishnah, he's quoting a beautiful teaching from his own son. And then we're going to go back, as we mentioned first, we're going to go back to Hillel, sort of one of the primary figures, and then we're going to do the lineage, Hillel, Rabbi, and his student, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and then Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai's 5 students. Now, Rabbi, of course, he has a name, but in the Mishnah, we never call him by his name. We always call him Rabbi. It's like Lavdil, the great one. And for those who live in Canada, I assume many of us, I say the great one. I don't have to say who I'm talking about. Everybody knows. So when you say Rabbi, you don't have to say Rabbi's the greatest rabbi. Why is he the greatest rabbi? And then there's why Rabbi, Rabban Shal Yisrael. That's what he's the rabbi of the Jewish people. Because without Rabbi, we wouldn't be here today. I mean, you can say that about a lot of people. But in other words, Rabbi was the one, of course, who made the fateful decision to write down the Torah Ba'al Peh, to commit the oral Torah to writing in the Mishnah, and we've discussed this in many different contexts. This, I don't know if people realize, if you think about it, how radical a decision that was. Basically, I mean, this, if you want to talk about reforming Judaism, I mean, this is about as great as a reform as you can get. He changed the fundamental nature of Torah. Torah was obligated to be oral. We didn't want to write down the Torah on purpose. Why not? Because we didn't want people to be able to read a book and know what's going on. We wanted people, I mean, that's one of the reasons. We wanted people to be dependent on teachers, because Torah is all about our parents teaching and our teachers teaching, right? That Torah is about transmission, and Torah is about morals and values, and you learn best by personal example. You can't learn as much from a book. You don't see everything. So the Torah was very insistent. When the Torah was given, the Torah is very cryptic. The Torah explains almost nothing. We wouldn't know how to keep Shabbos kosher. We wouldn't know anything from what's written in the Torah. So this is an idea that troubles a lot of people, right? People are not observant. They're often troubled by it. Yeah, it's not in the Torah. The rabbis made it up. We don't accept that, but I understand where that argument is coming from. So it has to be oral. So, and yes, of course, there were conditions that made oral very hard. For those who were on the class on Wednesday night, fascinating class, Dr. Seidman was saying the rabbis in Poland in the beginning of the 1900s, there was a big meeting to found the school, 1903. For girls, because they knew that it was a disaster what was going on in Poland. I'm not going to go over the whole thing, and the girls really had to learn. But you know what? They couldn't do it. They couldn't do it because teaching girls Torah can't have formal education for girls. It's against the Gemara. The Gemara says if you teach your daughters Torah, you're teaching her tiflut, licentiousness. We're too modern. We can't do it. It took Sarah Schneer, to do it more than 10 years later, a little bit more. So very often people know there's a problem. We all know this, but they don't act. They don't have the courage to act. They don't have. They're frozen. They're frozen. So the idea of bringing down Torah was really, really, really radical, and it took a tremendous leadership. And the Gemara quotes, he nullified eight lasot lashem efer tortecha. They quote a pasuk in Tehillim. There's a time to act for God. He nullified the Torah. Now, even saying that, in other words, the Gemara says that when Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi wrote down the Mishnah, he nullified Torah. The Torah is not the same Torah. It's not Torah it's a totally different Torah. It's now in writing. It's very different. And so that's why he's Rabbi, because he was the one who saved Torah, made a very courageous, bold, controversial decision. I'm sure rabbis were yelling at him and screaming at him and furious with him, and they threw him out. You don't see that, but I can't imagine it didn't happen. And because he took he nullified the Torah. By the way, that's the real reason. So I'm saying we can't argue on the Mishnah. We can't argue sort of pre-Mishnah. We can't argue on the Mishnah. There was a fundamental change in the nature of Torah. What happened before? In other words, new drashah, but that's a whole other subject. In other words, how in practice did our ability to change? Like we know, for example, today, it's generally not allowed, we assume it's not allowed to make a drasha on a pasuk in the Chumash. The way the rabbis read between the lines, and I don't want to say they make up things, but there's a whole debate when the rabbis make a drasha. Many, maybe most assume it's not, like we said with Rabbi Lazar, it's not what the Torah says. It's whatever the rabbis say the Torah says, that's what it says in the Torah. I mean, the rabbis have to be learned, and they have to be truthful, and they have to be humble, and they have to, but the Torah is what the rabbis say. The Torah is not what the Torah says. That's what we said, the whole story of Tanur Shalaknai, the whole story of, throwing out Rabbi Eliezer because he wanted what God said, and the rabbi said no. So the Torah is sort of gray, and God gave it to us. And what does the Torah mean? The Torah means whatever the rabbis say it means. It's up to you. The rabbis could have come up with different categories forbidden on Shabbos. So we can't do that anymore. That's the whole debate. We mentioned this before. We can't do this anymore. When we have a Sanhedrin, we will be able to do this. And that's why, I know when we mentioned that why the push in 1948, Yehuda Leib Maimon, to recreate a Sanhedrin, to allow us to reinterpret the Torah. But we can't do that because there was a fundamental change. Anyway, that's Rebbe. Just a little bit Rebbe, and he sort of ends the period of the Mishnah. Rebbe dies in the year 220 or so. The Rebbe is also very close with the Romans emperor, right? It's 60 years. I mean, whatever. It's a generation, or it's 2 generations after the Bar Kokhba revolt, and the Romans they didn't have the persecution that we often accuse them. Rebbe had a very good relationship with them. Anyway, so Rebbe says, "Ezu derech yishara sheyavor lo adam." What is the straight path that a person should yavor should dig for themselves? So just a little bit, I'll very briefly mention a famous comment of the Ezu derech yishara. It's a very interesting comment. What is the straight path that a person should go? We have to be straight. So Vasita Yashar Vatov, that's a verse in the Torah, and guess what? That is the source of the obligation to act Nifnim Mishur Hadin. He's continuing on the same theme. The Ramban on the Pasuk of Asita Yashar Batov says, the Torah can tell us this law, that law, don't take revenge, don't gossip, honor your parents, pay your worker on time. It can't tell us everything. So we have to have, Basita Yashar Batov tells us we have to do more than what it says in Torah. We have to do Nifnim Mishur Hadin. The Torah will give us a few examples. We have to apply. I don't know if I ever mentioned, he gives an example of a very difficult law. Did I ever mention bar mitzvah, the law of bar mitzvah? The neighbor, you have to offer your property to your neighbor at fair market value when you sell it. It's a fascinating law that business people today would find, we would find this insane. Are you crazy? In other words, you want to sell your house your house is worth $1 million. And that's what it's worth on the market, and that's the best offer you have. And then your neighbor comes along. Now, your neighbor's happy to pay you a million too, because he wants to knock down your house and put up a monster home. And then we can have a big white lot, and obviously you want two houses next to each other. He's very happy. He doesn't even know the other guy offered $1 million. So he offers you $1.3 million, because to him, it's worth a lot of money to have two houses. So the Ramban says, you can't do that. The pasuk, Basita Yashar B'Tov, no. The house is worth $1 million. I can't take advantage of my neighbor. The house, it's not really worth $300,000 more because of his personal circumstance that he happens to be your neighbor and it's easy for him to get two houses next to each other. He wants your house, so he's willing to pay $300,000. Basita Yashar B'Tov, you got to give him the house for $1 million. So most people listening, I know when I teach this in chat sometimes, some of the students, and I'm happy they do this. They argue with me. That's ridiculous. The guy's willing to pay, and I think that's the way we're all brought up. That's ridiculous. What do you mean? I'm going to sell my house to the highest bidder. I'm not forcing him to pay $1.3 million. He wants two houses next to each other. Great. I can make a killing here. So that's a very hard thing. That's no. This is not the. I think it's totally legal. What do you mean? There's no. I'm not doing anything illegal there. I'm not even doing anything illegal in Jewish law. This is lifnim mishur adin. This, in other words, this gray area where it's not legally enforceable, but you're mandated to act lifnim mishur adin. So that's the Ramban's explanation of why. What does it mean? Basita yashar b'tov. It's a pasuk in Parshat Chanan. We read it right after Tisha B'av. Interestingly enough, obviously that's a rabbinic thing. The way it works out, we read it right after Tisha B'av, destruction of the temple. So we read that Shabbos. We're going to read about the obligation to do lifnim mishur. In other words, Vasida Yashar B'Tov is an unnecessary verse. The Ramban explains. The Torah is good and straight. Why does the Torah have to tell follows the Torah? So it must be adding that it's not enough to follow what's in the Torah. You got to do Yashar B'Tov. Now, the Netzi very famously in his introduction to Bereshit explains that a Yashar, and it's clear in the Ramban too. The Yashar is mitzvah between man and man. The Lifnim Mishurat Hadin between man and God, which I guess Rabbi Turchiner alluded to last night when he was speaking about going to Minyan, even if you don't have to, whatever, going on vacation where there's no Minyan, is the pasuk of Kedoshim to you, to be holy. So that pasuk, the same Ramban explains, the Torah can't tell you everything what to do. So the Torah gives, but it's in our relationship to God, that's holiness. So we have to do a little bit more in what God asks us to do. But Asita Yashar B'Tov is our relationship between man and man. And the Netziv explains that Sefer Bereshit in rabbinic literature is called Sefer HaYashar, the book of the straight, because it deals with how to get along with people or how not to get along. Everybody in Bereshit isn't getting along. That's the problem. So we're supposed to learn from Sefer Bereshit how we should get along. Who do we learn this from? We learned it from Avram Avinu. Because Avram Avinu, he prayed for Stom. Wow. He prayed for idolaters. He prayed for the lowest of the low, that God should spare them. We also wouldn't do that so much, right? But that's what it means to care about God's creations. And then Netziv says he hated what they did in Sodom. They're human beings, and we don't pray for their downfall at all. So Yashar, Ezer Derech Yashar, is always referring to our relationship to man, which you can see actually in Rebbe's answer. The path to choose is what's good for you and what's good for people. God isn't really mentioned here. I guess behind the scene. Quote, Tiferet is, of course, beauty. Pe'er is beauty. Koshi Tiferet Lo'osa. It's good for you. It's like what we learned before. I got to be for myself. But if I'm for myself only, who am I? You've got to be a combination of what's good for me, what's good for others. The Bartenura actually quotes, I don't want to say quotes the Rambam, he's quoting Aristotle, whoever he's quoting here the responsibility of the golden mean that the Rambam puts in Hilchot Deot, that a person shouldn't be too miserly, but he shouldn't spend money too freely. In every path, you should go in the middle. What's the one exception, by the way? The one path you shouldn't be in the middle of. There's one character trait the Rambam says, I think there's one, in Hilchot Deot, that we don't take the middle path. We should be extremists. No, anybody know? This week's Parsha, that's why I mentioned it. This week's Parsha. Somebody help me out, okay. Va'ish Moshe And not be called a tamashar pnei adama. When it comes, have a mo'od shvav ruach, be very, very humble. When it comes to being humble, right, it's the only character trait the Torah tells us about Moshe Rabbeinu. So yes, you have to be a moderate. That's how the Rambam, based on Aristotle, every path, not too much like this. Extremism is bad. You should just, or Rabbi Lamb used to always say we should be extreme moderates. We should be extremists in our moderation. Okay. But the one character trait that we should be an extremist in is to be very humble. And that's why the Torah singles out that trait and that trait only by Moshe Rabbeinu. Humility, of course, doesn't mean you don't know you're great. Moshe knew he was great. Humility means you use your greatness in the right way, not being arrogant about it, realizing the greater you are, the more responsibility you have. It's not how much say, oh, I'm a nobody, right? You have to be a somebody to be a nobody, right? Doesn't mean I'm a nobody. That's what it means to be humble. Be humble is to use your talents in the proper way. No. But anyways, so you have to do what's good for you and good for other people. We said the Bartanur says the middle path, except when it comes to humble. Be as careful with the light mitzvahs, the heavy mitzvahs. So these are well-known ideas. Hopefully there's something, even if, the Mesilat Yesharim always says the most important thing is to review the basics. We know things, but we have to internalize them. But hopefully there's some new ideas. You have to be as careful with the light mitzvah and heavy mitzvah. So I don't know if people are aware, it's become more famous, I think, in recent years. The Rambam says, what's a light mitzvah? You have to be careful and meticulous in a light mitzvah and a heavy mitzvah. So the Rambam says a light mitzvah is speaking Hebrew. I think I mentioned once I have somebody know in yeshiva used to speak in Hebrew only on Shabbos. On Shabbos you would only speak in Hebrew. Anyways, the extra mitzvahs on Shabbos. That's what the Rambam says. It's funny. It's very interesting. But what's the idea? First of all, you see that you have mitzvah kala and chamura, right? Very often, when people say all the mitzvot are equally important, that's not true at all. Totally not true. I mean, we all know that, but you hear this sometimes. No, that's not true. Keeping Shabbos is more important than keeping kosher, and giving tzedakah is more important than putting on tefillin. I mean, it's like there's a hierarchy. We have a hierarchy of mitzvot, and we for sure know when it comes. The Mishnah is going to allude to this. When it comes to negative commandments, it's very easy to know what's important. Because if the Torah has a death penalty, that means it's pretty important. And the Torah has no punishment, like leaving over the Korban Pesach. There's no punishment if you leave over the Korban Pesach. It means a little bit less important. You shave with the razor, it's a little bit more important because you get lashes. And if you eat food that didn't have truma, you have a little bit more. That's mita b'dei shemayim, death at the hands of heaven. And if you have an affair with your aunt, so that's karet. You don't get a death penalty for an affair with your aunt. If you have an affair with a married woman, then you get a death penalty for it. But if your aunt who's single, or then it's karet. So we know there's a hierarchy. What mitzvah is more important, and what mitzvah are less important. At the same time, I always love to point out a very insightful comment. Again, it ties into what we said on the Drisha before, that Dina met lamito, you have to know to apply the law in its time and its place. You can't live abstractly. You can't have a computer. That's why the rabbi has to know you. We've discussed all these ideas. But the Meshech Chachma, Rav Meir Simcha of the Vins, died in, I believe, 1926. So he has a beautiful comment that mitzvot have historical importance, that in different times in history, certain mitzvot take on greater importance. He said that in the context of the Midrashim and why the Jews were merited to leave Egypt. So we know either there's a combination of Midrashim. They didn't change their clothes, their names, their language. They spoke Hebrew, right? They wore whatever a shtreimel or a gartel. I don't think that's what it means, but whatever. They had their unique clothing and different things. No, it's very nice. So the Meshech and Rav Moshe Feinstein points this out in a tshuva. Somebody asked Rav Moshe Feinstein, can you give, let's take a real personal example. Can you give your son the name Jay? How can we give your son the name, Jay? That's maybe I shouldn't talk like them, right? So Rav Moshe says, of course you can. It says the Jewish people were redeemed. We left Egypt. We didn't change our names. That's a medrash, first of all. But he says, no, that's before the Torah was given. Before the Torah was given, the only way to maintain Jewish identity, we didn't have mitzvot, we didn't have matzah and sukkah and shofar and tefillin. We had no way to maintain our Jewish and mezuzah. So we maintained our Jewish identity culturally. We had a Jewish name. So it's a nice idea to have a Jewish name. And that's what we do in our generation. But in my generation, many of us, although not my sister online, many of us, have English names. I'm Tzvi Yehuda, but I'm Jay Hirsch. So, and Rav Moshe said, that's no problem. When we have mitzvot, that's other mitzvot, there's no mitzvah. It's a nice thing, but, and we know what is, Yishmael is a great name, Abaye and Herman, you have all these names in the Talmud. So the Meshech Chochmah says that what's the Medrash driving at? The Medrash driving at that time period, these names were very important. But in different time periods, it's not so important. So basically what I just quoted from Moshe, halachically. And he says mitzvot, in every generation, there are mitzvot that take on greater historical importance. Rav Schachter, when he wrote up in the first edition of the RJJ Journal, the Journal of Halacha and Contemporary Society that started Rabbi Cohen in the 80s, very interesting articles, twice a year. So I think it was in the second or third issue, Rav Hershel Schachter has a beautiful article on the mitzvah to live in Israel. Are you obligated to live in Israel? It's just something nice to do. And he holds it is obligated, although Rav Avram Shapiro, the chief rabbi of Israel, told Rav Schachter it's forbidden for him to make aliyah. He's not allowed to make aliyah because he's teaching too many people in America and he wouldn't have the same influence in Israel. We know that's often true. People go on aliyah and sometimes rabbis, they're lost a little bit, unfortunately. So Rav Avram Shapiro told Rav Schachter it's forbidden for him to make aliyah, and Rav Schachter writes why he disagrees with him. He thinks he's wrong. He should be making aliyah. No, we won't go into that. But at the end of the article, he quotes this Meshech Chochmah. And he says the mitzvah of our generation is to live in Israel. If every generation, it's true there was a mitzvah in the 1200s to live in Israel, but didn't really mean much. So Rabbi Yehuda, not Rabbi Yehuda Chassid, or maybe it was him. We moved to Israel. A number of the Balei HaTosfot tried to move to Israel. No, but it didn't really have such impact. The Torah didn't change. But in 1948 or maybe 1848, it moved to Israel. It's a big deal. And it's very important. And it's, you're not supporting the Turkish economy or the British economy. You're building up a Jewish state. So that mitzvah takes on greater responsibility. And then he added another point, a little, scary point. You don't want to be too Zionistic here, but he says that we know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu went into exile with us. Imo Anochi B'Tzara. We believe that God accompanied us. He exiled us, but at least he protects us. But he quoted the halacha that if a person, Rahman al-Litzlan, a person kills somebody by accident. So according to her, he has to go to an Ari Miklat. Ari Miklat was a regular city. You wouldn't know the person was necessarily a murderer. He couldn't leave. But everybody else could leave. It was a normal city, and they said they would give him an aliyah on Shabbos. He would have to tell them he's a murderer if they didn't know. It was a normal city, but this person, his jail was not to leave the city. So the Gemara says he has to live there a normal life. You don't put him in jail behind bars. He has to live there normal. So what's normal? No, normal means he needs Torah. He needs a yeshiva. He needs a day school. So the Gemara says if a person, that's an amazing halacha, it's like astounding. So his Rabbi has to go with him. His Rabbi has to go with him to the Ari Miklat, or I don't know if he doesn't have to move there necessarily. He has to go once a week, whatever. Has to teach him before Zoom. Maybe Zoom, I don't know if he has to go anymore, but in the pre-Zoom area, he had to go to the Ari Miklat and teach the person Torah, because that's not a life. A life without Torah is not living. So the Rebbe has to go. So what happens? The Kohen Gadol dies. Then the Kohen Gadol dies, then the person can leave the Ari Miklat. We won't go into why, what's the relationship. He dies. So at that point, the guy says, I like it in the Ari Miklat, like a slave. After 6 years, I like it here. It's nice. I don't want to leave. So the Rebbe doesn't have to go anymore. In other words, the Rebbe only has to go because he's forced to live there. So we got to provide an education. But if he chooses not to leave, that's not the Rebbe's responsibility. So Rav Schachter said, that's a pretty scary thought, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, he forced us into exile. Okay, He forced us into exile. We like to, he has to accompany us. The Rabbi has to accompany his students. So God had to come with this in exile. But now he said, now you can go back to Israel. You're not in exile anymore. Exile is over. Move back to Israel. So God went back to Israel. And do we want to stay here? That's our problem. We're not going to be here. I don't know what that means and whatever, but I just figured I'll throw that out. If anybody wants to throw stones on me, that's okay. But anyways, I talk, so what am I doing here in Toronto? It's a good question. Okay, anyways. So that's mitzvah kala b'chamura, just the Meshech Chochmah, their mitzvah, every generation has a key mitzvah. So they're important mitzvah in a hierarchy of mitzvot, right? The Lotus say it's very easy to know. Add on this I think it's a beautiful idea of the Meshech Chochmah historical mitzvot in every generation. And I would say the Mesilat Yesharim sort of alludes to it. Every person has personal mitzvot. Everybody has a personal mitzvah they like. Some people are great at stuck. If you're blessed to be a billionaire, sign the giving pledge. And, that should be your life. Your mitzvah is to give tzedakah. Other people, everybody has individual mitzvot they're good at, or they even like. That's fine. They like. So mitzvot, there is a sort of a movement here. Lefi makom v'hazman, right? According to your personal inclination, there is an objective standard to mitzvot, of course, but there's a subjective standard. But there's a hierarchy to mitzvot. Wearing a kippah is not even a mitzvah. It's a nice minhag. It's also a fascinating example because the kippah has taken on great importance. The Taz has a amazing comment. The Torah's living in the 17th century, the 16th, 17th century. The Torah's David Siegel, the flourishing generation in Poland, commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, writes that not to wear a kippah is a violation of the biblical commandment of Bechukotem lo telechu. You're not allowed to walk in the ways of the non-Jews, because non-Jews, they're right to you. We know that's you go to church or play the national anthem, you have to take off your head covering. It's disrespectful. So a Jew wearing a kippah became the symbol of a Jew, and therefore it's no longer a kippah, it's a demonstration. And therefore, if you don't wear a kippah, you're violating a biblical command. Whoa. What's maybe not even a minhag, not directly mentioned in any of Talmudic sources, becomes a biblical commandment. That's what he claims. Ramosha Feinstein, in one of his early truths, said that's not true anymore. It's a whole different. And that's why Ramosha Paskin, that if you go to work and you're on a job interview and you feel it will hinder you at work, you wear the strange symbols today. It's not really true, especially we live in a multicultural society. But the West true, you can take off your kippah. Anyways, the importance of mitzvot change over time, over circumstance, but they're important mitzvot. However, we don't know matan scharan shel mitzvot. We don't fully know the reward for mitzvot. So part of it is because of what I said. Because mitzvot are related to our time and place, we don't know what what mitzvah is really important for that time. So we don't, even though we know in the Torah what's important mitzvot, we sometimes, you can say a greeting to somebody, and it's so important to that person because of something you don't even know about. So we don't know what we're doing. That's one way to understand. That's, I think, the plain way to understand it. That even though we have a sort of a hierarchy, there are all these sociological factors that we're unaware of. The way many of the Mefarshim explain it is that this hierarchy of mitzvot, a death penalty, karet, lashes, nothing, that's really mitzvot lo taseh. The mitzvot aseh, the positive mitzvot, the Torah doesn't really give us reward. Sending away the mother bird, honoring your parents' honest ways, that's about it. The Torah doesn't really give rewards for positive mitzvot. So we don't really know which positive mitzvot is more important than that. Again, because you're doing something, reframing, it's easier to know. That's more general. That's not as time dependent, right? What you can't do is less time dependent. What you have to do is much more time dependent, in a sense. So maybe that's why the Torah, maybe that's why the Torah didn't put in rewards. Because I understand adultery is always adultery. Don't give me the times are different. We live in the sexual revolution. Doesn't work. But mitzvot say that will change the importance. So perhaps the Torah purposely left out the mitzvot. I don't know. Okay, but you have to think about this Hefsed mitzvah keneged schara, schar aveira keneged hafseda, the reward for a sin against its loss. Of course, there's a reward for sin. Otherwise, you're a total idiot if you sin. Obviously, sinning is good. It's fun. It's pleasurable. Though there is a schar of aveira. You cheat. 90% of the people who cheat don't get caught. It's of course, aveiras are good. Otherwise, who would sin? Right, so you have to think there is a schar aveira, but it's fleeting, it's momentary, and it debases us and it ruins our character. So we have to place that reward, that momentary reward, against the loss. Histakel, just want to finish up quickly. Histakel b'shlosh dvarim, look at three things. Histakel means more than look. Focus. Histakel, the rod is to look. The histakel. And you won't come to sin. And of course, we have four things. Know that there's a God above you. We've spoken. That's hard. It's hard to know there's God above you. Maybe I'll pick up a Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai story next week. Go know. I assume Ein Roav Ozen Shomad is really one. A seeing eye and a hearing ear. Whatever you can do is written in the books. Whenever I teach this Mishnah, I always like to point out, until recently, this Mishnah was based on faith. That Rabbi's teaching us, we should know that everything we do, there's a seeing eye, there's a hearing ear, and it's written down. Okay, we believe that God sees everything, hears everything, and he writes it down in the book, and he reads the book on Rosh Hashanah. That's what the imagery of Rosh Hashanah. So it's all very nice, but it's faith. Today, you can be the biggest atheist in the world, and you know this Mishnah is true. Everything we do is written down. You write an email, that's for all time. It's, everything you say is recorded. Seeing, this Mishnah is totally, to be the biggest atheist in the world, and we understand that Ein Ro'ah Ozen Shomat V'chol Masecha, the Sefer Nichtavim. It's a very powerful Mishnah, and that's the famous story. I think it's a famous story of the Chafetz Chaim. How do you define a famous story, right? If you know it, I guess it's famous, or if you hear it a lot. But story, of the Chafetz Chaim, who would have said that the Chafetz Chaim died in 1935, 1933 or 1935. Chafetz Chaim lived to be, I think the New York Times obituary had him at 102. I think some Jews list him at 95. And people didn't know. I don't know if he didn't know when he was born. The records were a lot different, and I don't think he really cared, but so much. But even the fact that there's an obituary in the New York Times, you can probably find it online. Not so many rabbis in Poland who die get an obituary in the New York Times. But when the Chafetz Chaim died, the saintly tzaddik, the Chafetz Chaim died, there was an obituary in the New York Times about him. So anyways, the Chafetz Chaim, he lived, he was born in the 1830s, died in the 1930s, so he witnessed a lot. He witnessed a lot of change. Religious change, of course, social, they went together. Technological change, religious change, social change, political change. The world changed a lot in his lifetime. And he said, it's changing a lot in our lifetimes too. He said that every invention teaches us a moral lesson. Of course, the famous one he quoted is on the phone. The phone teaches us, Mr. Lashon Hara, Rabbi Lashon Hara, teaches us that what you say over here is heard over there. I don't know what he would say on the internet. If that's the message of the phone, oh my gosh, the religious value of the internet. It's a beautiful, very important, simple but powerful idea that every modern invention has a religious message to teach us. So that's what we have in this Mishnah, that the internet teaches us a lot, and the Zoom, everything teaches us a lot. We have to learn, but that's basically what we're saying. Okay, all right. I'll stop here. Let's quickly review. We started out by pointing the missing Rav and Gamliel in the hierarchy of mitzvot, and then we talked about Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, speaking about din emet and shalom, the relationship between Torah, Avot, and Gmilut Chasadim, and din emet and shalom. Din and emet are very important, but it can't just be truth. It has to be emet lamito. It has to be a truth to its time and place, which means litni mishur adin. Sometimes the judges have to do what looks right to the left, right, even if the right is the left, because we can't all yikov adin tahar. The law can be uncompromising and unforgiving, and we don't want that. We want a law that is based on shalom. The din, the emet, have to lead to shalom. Otherwise, what's the whole purpose? We spoke about the importance of litni mishur adin. God, who davens every day, he davens that he should have litni mishur adin. Jerusalem was lost because of Lifnei Mishur Adin, and that's derived from the pasuk Vasita Hayashar. That's how the Ramban describes it, and he gives the example of not ripping off your neighbor. We wouldn't call it ripping off, but that's what he calls it. Your neighbor who's willing to pay more. And then Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi picks up with the notion of the derech hayashar, the way of the path, is that people should be happy with what you do, because yashar is the Netziv develops, right? It's a relationship. Ramban, they all developed a relationship to other human beings. It's the middle path. It's good for you. You can't only be concerned with other people. You have to be concerned with other yourself also. And then you have to look, and the same thing on mitzvot. You have to place the mitzvot in their proper context, which is what the Torah says it, but there's a historical context, there's a social context, there's a personal context. So just answer one comment I think somebody sent me privately. It's an interesting point. Why the Rebbe has to go to the Ari Miklat? Aren't there the Ari Miklat? Many of them were cities, not all of them were cities of the Levim. The Levim are the teachers of the Torah. Levim Kohanim taught Torah. So couldn't he get a teacher there? So no, the Gemara says your teacher. It's not any teacher works. Everybody knows that. You have your teachers you like. People learn best from their own good teachers. You can't just have a teacher to teach. It's very important how you develop this, how you apply this in the modern world. But there is a notion that's a sort of a Seilach Harav. You have to choose your teacher. Your teacher has to be somebody you relate to. It's not enough to throw somebody in the classroom and give him a teacher. Anybody who teaches in high school, like I do, knows that you hit it off with certain kids, and certain kids can't stand you. And Baruch Hashem, if you have a big school, the kid can transfer out of your class and go to another teacher. That's great. That's great. So it's not enough to have teachers. That makes the halacha much more powerful. The Arei Miklat, the Rebbe has to go with him because he's his Rebbe. He's his teacher. That's why we talked about Israel. One of the excuses for leaving Israel is to go study Torah. What, you can't study Torah in Israel? There's so much Torah. No. You have a particular closeness to a particular teacher who lives outside of Israel. It's also a very fascinating halakha. Okay, please God, everybody, have a wonderful Shabbat. Be healthy, be well. We look forward to seeing you Sunday morning, 11 a.m. Rabbi Mintz on the founding of the Maimonides School. That's going to be his topic all week. I will mention it hasn't been announced yet. Officially, next Thursday, we're going to be introducing a new series, Ari Zivotofsky, Rabbi Dr. Ari Zivotofsky, who writes in the OU magazine everything on myths in Judaism. Is going to be giving a 3-part series on sort of nature and the animal kingdom. Should be very interesting. I'll be posting it on our next email. And okay, well, if anybody has any other questions, comments, or thank you very much, and the pleasure to see those who I see and hear, and Shabbat Shalom, and be well, everybody.